"Step back," he said, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade that had never been challenged. The sound of polished shoes against marble echoed too loud in the quiet room. Each step deliberate, each movement owned, as Officer Ryan Whitmore approached without slowing, without looking twice, as if the space in front of him had already been cleared by the weight of his uniform alone. But it hadn't. Not this time, because Monica Carter didn't move. The air shifted, subtle at first, like the hum before a storm. Papers stilled mid-turn, a pen hovering just above a legal pad. The judge glancing up from the bench with a faint crease forming between his brows. Not yet concern, just interruption, but enough to feel the change. Ryan exhaled through his nose, impatient, his hand gesturing sharply toward the side aisle. "I said step back. You're in the wrong place." His tone wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried the kind of authority that came from years of being obeyed without question, from rooms that parted before he ever had to ask, from people who knew better than to hesitate. Monica stood still, her fingers lightly gripping a thin folder, the edges worn, the paper inside slightly curled from use. Not new, not polished, just real. Her coat was simple, charcoal gray, the kind you could wear anywhere without drawing attention, and that was the point, because most people in that room had already decided what she was before she even spoke, before she even breathed too loudly in their direction. Someone near the back shifted in their seat, the leather creaking under the movement, and a low murmur almost formed before dying in the same second, swallowed by the tension that had settled like dust in sunlight. Ryan stepped closer, too close now, his shadow cutting across her shoes, his presence filling the small space between them as if proximity alone would force compliance. "You don't belong up here," he added, quieter this time, but sharper, the kind of quiet that pressed harder than shouting ever could. Monica lowered her gaze for a brief second, not in submission, not quite, more like she was choosing where to place her attention, and then she bent slightly, adjusting the folder in her hands as if the moment itself had no urgency, as if his words hadn't landed the way he expected them to. The movement was small, almost invisible, but it disrupted something, just enough to make a few heads turn, just enough to make the silence stretch a little longer than it should have. Up on the bench, the judge's fingers paused mid-tap against the wood, a rhythm broken. "Officer," he began, but Ryan didn't look back, didn't break his line of focus, because he was used to finishing things his way, used to controlling the sequence of events until they aligned with what he already believed to be true. Monica straightened slowly, her posture calm, steady, her shoulders relaxed in a way that didn't match the tension around her, and when she finally looked up, her eyes met his without flinching, without challenge, just there, present, grounded, like she had nowhere else to be and no reason to rush. It wasn't defiance. It was something quieter, something harder to move. The fluorescent lights above cast a cool glow across the room, reflecting off the polished floor, catching in the edge of her eyes, and for a fraction of a second, Ryan hesitated, not fully, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough for the rhythm of the room to shift again, a subtle misstep in an otherwise controlled performance. "Last warning," he said, the words clipped now, less smooth than before, a faint edge creeping in that hadn't been there at the start. Monica's fingers adjusted on the folder once more, the paper making a soft, dry sound, almost too quiet to hear, but in that silence, it carried. She took a small step, not back, not away, just to the side, aligning herself with the center aisle, her movement deliberate, measured, like she was following a path no one else could see yet. A clerk near the front desk glanced down at a list, then back up at her, then down again, something not quite adding up, but not yet enough to speak. The room held its breath without knowing it was doing so. Monica's voice, when it came, was calm, even, almost gentle, but it didn't disappear into the room the way most voices like hers usually did. It stayed. "You shouldn't have said that," she said softly, not accusing, not emotional, just clear, the kind of clarity that didn't need volume to be heard. Ryan let out a short, humorless breath, shaking his head slightly as if dismissing something too small to matter, but the corner of his jaw tightened, just barely, a flicker of something that didn't belong in his usual certainty. Behind them, the courtroom remained still, suspended between what had just happened and whatever was about to follow, like a moment stretched thin enough to tear. And Monica Carter didn't move again. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like a glass surface under pressure, subtle cracks forming where no one had been looking, and Ryan Whitmore felt it before he understood it. The way conversation stopped just a fraction too long. The way a few eyes no longer followed him but drifted past him, toward her, toward the woman who still stood there without urgency, without apology, as if the room had already rearranged itself around something he could not see. He straightened slightly, adjusting his stance, the faint creak of leather from his duty belt cutting through the stillness, a familiar sound meant to ground him, to remind everyone else who held authority here. But it landed differently now, flatter, almost out of place. Up on the bench, the judge leaned forward, fingers interlaced, gaze narrowing not in anger but in curiosity, the kind that comes when a detail refuses to fit. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his tone measured. "Do you have business before this court today?" Monica Carter did not answer immediately. She shifted her weight just enough to settle into stillness again, her shoes quiet against the polished floor, her posture neither defensive nor submissive, just present, fully, in a way that drew attention without asking for it. The folder in her hands remained closed, her thumb resting along its edge as if she had opened it 100 times before and did not need to do it again. Somewhere to the right, a clerk flipped a page too quickly, the paper snapping softly, then slowing, eyes scanning a list with growing focus, lips parting slightly as if about to speak, then stopping, uncertain. Ryan let out a short breath through his nose, the faintest hint of irritation creeping in, not because anything had been said, but because nothing had, and that absence felt like resistance he could not address directly. "She is not on the docket," he said, cutting in before Monica could respond, his voice sharper now, more controlled, as if tightening it would restore the balance he was used to. "We should move this along." The judge did not look at him right away. Instead, his gaze lingered on Monica, studying, weighing something unspoken, then flicked briefly toward the clerk, catching that hesitation, that almost comment, and holding it there. "Let her answer," he said, calm, but firm enough to settle back into the room like a new center of gravity. Ryan's jaw tightened, barely, a small shift at the corner of his mouth that most people would miss. But it was there, a crack in the rhythm he had maintained since he walked in. Monica finally lifted the folder, not opening it, just bringing it slightly higher, aligning it with her chest, her fingers steady, her movements economical, as if nothing needed to be wasted. "I am exactly where I need to be," she said, her voice even, carrying just enough to reach the far rows without effort, without strain, and something about the phrasing lingered longer than it should have, echoing faintly in the quiet that followed. A man seated near the aisle shifted forward, elbows resting on his knees, attention sharpened, while another further back leaned toward his neighbor, whispering something too low to catch, but the tone carried curiosity, not dismissal. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, a constant that suddenly felt louder against the stillness, and Ryan became aware of it, of the way the room seemed to amplify small things now, details he had never needed to notice before. "That is not how this works," he replied, the words coming quicker, more automatic, but lacking the ease they had carried earlier, as if he were reciting a rule that no longer applied cleanly. Monica's eyes remained on him, not challenging, not yielding, simply holding the space between them without filling it, and that space began to feel heavier, like something waiting to be named. At the front desk, the clerk finally leaned closer to the list, tracing a line with a finger, then stopping abruptly, her shoulders stiffening, her gaze snapping up again, this time not uncertain, but alert. She looked toward the judge, then back at Monica, then down once more, confirming, rereading, as if the letters might rearrange themselves if she gave them the chance. "Your Honor," she started, her voice lower than usual, careful, almost cautious, but the judge raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to pause the moment, to hold it just long enough to see where it was going. Ryan shifted his weight again, the movement less controlled now, a faint scrape of his shoe against the floor breaking the quiet in a way that felt louder than it should have, and for the first time, he glanced briefly past Monica, scanning the room, as if searching for confirmation, for alignment, for the familiar cues that told him he was still in control. They were not there. not the way they had been. Monica did not move. The folder remained steady in her hands, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, and in the reflection of the polished floor, her silhouette held firm, unshaken by the tension gathering around it. The judge leaned back slightly, eyes still on her, something shifting behind them. Not yet recognition, but close enough to change the air, close enough that when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight. "Ma'am," he said, slower this time, more deliberate. "Please state your name for the record." For a brief second, no one moved. Not even the air seemed willing to shift, as if the room itself understood that whatever came next would not be undone once spoken, and Monica Carter felt it settle around her, not as pressure, but as clarity, the kind that sharpens everything into focus, the edges of the wooden bench, the faint hum of the overhead lights, the distant echo of footsteps somewhere down the hallway beyond the heavy courtroom doors, all of it aligning into a single, quiet moment, waiting to be claimed. She did not rush. Her fingers adjusted slightly along the edge of the folder, the paper inside making that same soft, dry sound, familiar now, grounding, and when she lifted her chin just enough to meet the judge's gaze fully, there was no hesitation left in it. "Monica Carter," she said, her voice steady, even, carrying across the room without effort, without strain, and the name seemed to land differently than expected, not because of how it was said, but because of where it settled, like it found something already waiting for it. The clerk's breath caught, small but audible in the silence, her eyes dropping quickly back to the list, tracing again, confirming what she had already seen, what she had almost said moments earlier, and this time she did not stop herself. "Your Honor," she said, a little louder now, the caution still there but edged with certainty. "That name is on the administrative transfer record from this morning." A ripple moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, just enough to disturb the stillness that had held everything in place, a few heads turning, a chair shifting, the faint whisper of fabric as someone leaned closer to hear better. Ryan Whitmore frowned, the expression forming slowly, as if his face had not yet caught up to the change in the room, his eyes flicking briefly toward the clerk, then back to Monica, searching for something that would make this align with what he already knew, with what he expected this moment to be. "That is not relevant to this proceeding," he said, but the words did not land with the same certainty as before, the edges softer, less anchored, like they were reaching for ground that was no longer there. The judge did not respond immediately. His gaze had shifted fully now, not just observing, but evaluating, the pieces assembling behind his eyes, the small details connecting, the hesitation from the clerk, the timing, the name, and something in his posture changed, subtle but unmistakable, a slight straightening, a recalibration of attention. "Administrative transfer," he repeated, more to himself than to the room, and then his eyes returned to Monica, sharper now, more focused. "Ms. Carter," he said, slower, deliberate. "Can you clarify your role here today?" Monica held his gaze, the same calm stillness in her posture, the same measured control in her breathing, and for a moment, she did not answer, not because she could not, but because the room was already beginning to answer for her, the pieces falling into place in the silence between them. Ryan shifted again, more noticeably this time, his hand brushing briefly against his belt, a habitual movement, but it did not settle him the way it usually did. His attention pulled now in more than one direction, the certainty he had carried into the room thinning with each passing second. "She has no role in this case," he insisted, but there was a question beneath it now, faint, unspoken, the kind that creeps in when control begins to slip. Monica finally moved, a small, deliberate step forward, not closing distance. Aggressively, just enough to align herself more clearly within the center of the room, within the line of sight of everyone present, and as she did, a beam of light from the high window caught the edge of the folder in her hands, reflecting briefly across the polished surface of the floor, drawing a line that seemed to connect her to the bench, to the space she now occupied without apology. "I am not here for the case," she said, her voice as calm as before, but carrying something new now, something that settled deeper, that held longer once heard. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition, as if he were arriving at the same conclusion the clerk had already reached, the same one the room was beginning to feel without fully understanding it yet. The clerk swallowed, her hand still resting on the list, her finger marking the line she had found, and this time she did not wait to be asked again. "Your Honor," she said, clearer now, the hesitation gone. "Monica Carter is listed as the incoming department head for city police, effective today at 0800 hours. The words did not echo, but they did not need to. They settled, heavy, precise, filling the space in a way nothing else had. And for a moment, everything stopped, not frozen, but recalibrating, adjusting to a reality that had just shifted without warning. Ryan's expression did not change all at once. It faltered, piece by piece, the confidence in his posture loosening, the certainty in his eyes flickering as the meaning of the words caught up to him, as the name he had dismissed moments ago settled into its full weight. Monica did not look away. She did not move. She simply stood there, exactly where she needed to be. The words did not need to be repeated. They lingered in the air with a weight that pressed against every surface in the room, settling into the wood of the bench, the polished floor, the still shoulders of those who had been watching without realizing they were witnessing a shift, and Ryan Whitmore felt it most in the silence that followed, not empty, but full, filled with something he had not accounted for, something that did not respond to rank or routine. His posture, once sharp and certain, held for a moment longer, out of habit, but the tension beneath it gave him away, a slight stiffness in his shoulders, a pause in his breathing that broke the rhythm he had carried in with him. He looked at Monica Carter again, really looked this time, not past her, not through her, but at her, searching for confirmation, for contradiction, for anything that would restore the version of reality he had been operating in just minutes before, but nothing in her expression shifted to meet that need. She remained still, composed, her gaze steady, not elevated, not lowered, just level, and that steadiness did more than any raised voice could have done. A chair creaked softly somewhere behind him as someone adjusted their position, the sound louder now against the stillness, and another voice whispered, barely audible, but enough to ripple through the room like a current passing from one person to the next. The judge leaned forward again, his fingers resting flat against the bench now, no longer tapping, no longer searching for rhythm, his attention fixed entirely on Monica. "Is that correct?" he asked, his tone no longer neutral, but careful, respectful in a way that had not been present before. Monica inclined her head slightly, a single, controlled motion that confirmed more than any explanation would have. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, and the simplicity of the response carried more authority than anything else spoken that morning. Ryan's throat tightened, not visibly, but enough that when he tried to speak, the first breath caught just slightly before the words followed. "There must be some mistake," he said, the sentence forming quickly, almost reflexively, but lacking the certainty that had defined him earlier, the edges of his confidence worn thin by the reality now settling in around him. The clerk shook her head, more firmly this time, her hand still resting on the document, anchoring her to it. "No, sir," she replied, her voice steady now, aligned with the information she held. "The transfer was processed at 8 o'clock this morning. Signed and verified." The words landed with precision, each one placing another piece into the structure that had already begun to form, and with each piece, the space Ryan occupied shifted, not physically, but in weight, in perception, in the way the room now oriented itself around a different center. He exhaled slowly, the sound quieter than he intended, and for the first time, he did not immediately fill the silence that followed. Instead, it stretched, giving space for the reality to settle, for the implications to move through him in a way he could not rush or control. Monica took a single step forward, not closing distance, not asserting dominance, just aligning herself with the front of the room, with the place where decisions were acknowledged and authority was recognized. And as she did, the light from the high window shifted slightly, catching along the edge of her coat, outlining her form against the muted tones of the courtroom, drawing attention without effort. She placed the folder gently on the edge of the clerk's desk, the soft contact of paper against wood echoing faintly in the quiet, and then her hands fell to her sides, relaxed, open, unguarded. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice calm, measured, carrying without force, and the phrasing itself held no accusation, no escalation, just clarity, the kind that leaves no room for confusion once spoken. Ryan's gaze followed the movement of the folder, then returned to her face, and something in his expression shifted again, not just uncertainty now, but recognition, the slow realization of how the moment had unfolded, of what had been assumed, of what had been said, and of what could not be taken back simply by adjusting tone or stance. He straightened, instinctively, a reflex that had always served him, but this time it did not restore what had been lost. It only highlighted the contrast between who he had been at the start of the morning and who he was now, standing in the same place, under the same lights, but within a completely different understanding of the room. The judge's gaze moved briefly between them, measuring not just the facts, but the space between them, the shift in dynamic that had occurred without formal declaration, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet authority that matched the moment. "Officer Whitmore," he said, and the name landed differently now, no longer reinforcing position, but calling it into question. "Step back." The instruction was simple, but its meaning extended beyond the physical movement it requested, and for a brief second, Ryan did not move, not out of defiance, but because the command had reached a place he had not expected it to, a place where habit and authority no longer aligned the way they once had. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stepped back, the sound of his shoe against the marble softer this time, less certain, and as he did, the space between him and Monica widened, not just in distance, but in understanding. Monica did not follow. She did not need to. She remained where she was, grounded, steady, her presence now fully recognized, fully acknowledged, and in that stillness, the room settled around her, not because she demanded it, but because it had finally caught up to what had been true from the moment she walked in. The distance between them changed everything, not because it was large, but because it was undeniable, a visible line drawn across the polished marble floor where authority had quietly shifted without permission, without announcement, and everyone in the room could feel it settling into place, adjusting their posture, their breathing, their understanding of what they were witnessing. Ryan Whitmore stood just behind that line now, no longer at the center of the moment, his hands resting near his sides in a way that felt unfamiliar, as if they had lost their usual purpose, and for the first time since he entered the courtroom, he did not speak immediately, did not fill the silence with instruction or correction, because the silence itself no longer belonged to him. Monica Carter remained where she was, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, not fixed on him anymore, but forward, aligned with the bench, with the space that now acknowledged her presence without question, and the calm in her expression did not soften the moment. It sharpened it, made every detail clearer, every movement more deliberate. The judge leaned back slightly, the weight of the shift evident in the way his posture settled. No longer searching, no longer uncertain, his authority now anchored in the clarity that had emerged, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a quiet decisiveness that matched the room. "Ms. Carter," he said, "welcome." The single word landed with more weight than a longer statement could have carried, and a faint murmur moved through the courtroom, not disruptive, but acknowledging, a recognition passing from one person to another, subtle but undeniable. Ryan swallowed, the motion small but visible now, his attention drawn back to Monica as if pulled by something he could not ignore, and when he finally spoke, his voice came slower, measured, as if each word had to pass through a space it had never encountered before. "If that is the case," he said, "then I was not informed." The statement hung there, part explanation, part defense, but it did not resolve anything. It only revealed the gap between what he had assumed and what was now true. Monica turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze again, and there was no anger in it, no satisfaction, just a steady awareness that held him in place more effectively than any accusation could have. "Information does not always arrive before the moment it is needed," she replied, her voice calm, even, and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality that left no space for argument. The clerk lowered her eyes briefly, organizing the documents in front of her with careful precision, as if aligning them physically could match the clarity that had just been established, while a man seated near the aisle exhaled softly, the sound almost like relief, though it was not entirely clear what he had been holding on to before. Ryan shifted his weight again, but this time the movement was slower, deliberate, no longer reactive, as if he were recalibrating himself within a space that no longer responded to him the way it once had. His gaze dropped briefly to the floor, to the reflection of his own shoes against the polished surface, then lifted again, returning to Monica, and something in his expression had changed, not completely, but enough to be noticed. The sharp certainty softened, replaced by something closer to awareness. The judge glanced between them once more, then turned his attention back to the proceedings. But the room had already moved beyond what had been scheduled, beyond the simple structure of the case, into something that could not be written into an agenda. Monica reached forward and opened the folder she had been holding, the soft rustle of paper echoing lightly. And for the first time, she looked down at its contents, not because she needed to confirm anything, but because the moment had shifted into its next phase, one that required action grounded in the same calm authority she had carried from the beginning. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "before this court proceeds, I would like to formally acknowledge my appointment and ensure that all officers present are aware of the updated chain of command effective as of this morning." The phrasing was precise, professional, leaving no room for interpretation, and as the words settled, the room adjusted again, not dramatically, but with a subtle alignment that followed the clarity she brought into it. Ryan did not interrupt. He did not step forward. He remained where he was, just behind that invisible line, and for a moment, he simply listened, the shift complete enough that even he could not deny it. The light from the high window continued to fall across the floor, steady, unchanged, but the way it reflected now felt different, as if the room itself had been rearranged around a truth that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. Monica Carter did not raise her voice, did not assert dominance, did not demand respect, and yet, as she stood there, grounded and unshaken, the entire room had already given it to her. The room did not return to normal. It adjusted into something quieter, more deliberate, as if every person inside it had become aware that what they were witnessing was no longer routine, no longer procedural, but something that carried weight beyond the case itself, and that awareness settled into their posture, their stillness, the way they listened. Monica Carter stood at the front, the open folder resting lightly beneath her hand, her presence no longer questioned, no longer filtered through assumption, and yet she did not rush to fill the space. She let it breathe, let it settle, as if understanding that clarity needed a moment to anchor itself before anything else could move forward. The judge nodded once, a small, respectful acknowledgement that carried authority without needing emphasis. "Proceed," he said, and the word did not interrupt the silence, it aligned with it. Monica glanced briefly down at the page, not reading so much as confirming, her eyes moving with familiarity, then lifting again to the room. "Effective today at 8 o'clock this morning," she said, her voice even, measured, "all departmental operations, including court conduct and officer accountability, fall under my direct oversight." The phrasing was precise, but the tone carried something deeper, not control, not dominance, but responsibility, the kind that does not need to announce itself loudly to be understood. A faint shift moved through the officers seated along the side wall, subtle adjustments in posture, shoulders straightening, attention sharpening, the unspoken recognition of a new command structure settling in without resistance, without confusion. Ryan Whitmore remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer anchored in certainty. It was reflective now, as if he were measuring something internally, replaying the past few minutes against what he now understood, and the contrast did not sit easily. His gaze drifted briefly toward the bench, then back to Monica, and this time he did not speak, not immediately, as if choosing his words required something he had not needed before. Monica's eyes moved across the room, not scanning for compliance, but acknowledging presence, each face, each uniform, each person now part of the structure she was stepping into, and when her gaze passed over Ryan, it did not linger, it did not avoid, it simply included him in the same steady recognition as everyone else. "This is not about correction," she continued, her voice soft but carrying. "It is about alignment." The words settled differently, less sharp than discipline, more enduring, and it seemed to shift something in the room, a subtle easing of tension that did not diminish the seriousness of the moment, but clarified its purpose. The clerk nodded faintly, almost unconsciously, as if the statement had resolved something she had not realized she was holding on to, while a man seated in the second row leaned back slightly, his arms crossing loosely, not defensive, but thoughtful. Ryan inhaled slowly, the breath visible now in the rise of his shoulders, and when he finally stepped forward again, it was not with the same force as before, not with the assumption of control, but with a measured intent, stopping short of the space Monica occupied, respecting the line that had already been drawn. "Chief," he said, the word deliberate, careful, carrying more than acknowledgement, carrying adjustment, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold on that single word, the shift it represented, the acceptance it implied. Monica inclined her head slightly, not in gratitude, not in concession, but in recognition of the change, however small, however recent. "Officer Whitmore," she replied, her tone unchanged, steady, and the balance in that exchange did more than any formal statement could have achieved. The judge observed the moment quietly, his expression unreadable but attentive, as if understanding that what had just occurred held significance beyond protocol, beyond hierarchy, something rooted in character rather than position. Monica rested her hand lightly on the folder again, then closed it with a soft, controlled motion, the sound of paper settling into itself echoing faintly, and in that small action, there was a sense of completion, not of the situation, but of the moment that had brought them here. "We will proceed," she said, her voice calm, certain, and as the words settled, the courtroom shifted once more, not dramatically, but with a quiet cohesion, the kind that follows clarity, the kind that does not need to be enforced because it has already been understood. Ryan stepped back slightly, returning to his position, but this time the movement carried awareness, not habit, and as he stood there, under the same lights, on the same floor, in the same uniform, he understood something he had not before, that authority could be worn, but respect had to be revealed. Monica Carter did not raise her voice, did not change her tone, did not demand anything, and yet the room moved with her now, aligned not by force, but by the quiet certainty of who she was and what she carried into it. The courtroom resumed its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm as before. It moved slower, more deliberate, as if every sound now carried meaning, every glance held intention, and the usual flow of procedure felt almost secondary to the quiet shift that had taken place. Papers moved again, but softer, more careful, the clerk organizing documents with a precision that mirrored the new order settling into the room, while the judge began to speak on the next matter, his voice steady, but occasionally pausing, as if aware that attention was still divided between the case and the present standing just a few feet below him. Monica Carter listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her breathing even, and yet there was something in the way she occupied the space that made everything else feel clearer, more defined, as if her stillness had recalibrated the entire room. Ryan Whitmore stood where he had stepped back, his shoulders squared, but no longer rigid, his stance adjusted in a way that suggested awareness rather than control, and as the proceedings continued, he found himself listening differently, not just to the judge, but to the silence between words, to the way people responded, to the subtle shift in how authority was being expressed without force. A witness was called, a man in his mid-30s, nervous, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as he approached the stand, his footsteps uneven against the marble, and as he began to speak, his voice wavered, catching on certain words, his eyes flicking toward Ryan briefly, then away, then toward Monica, and something in that glance lingered longer than expected, as if he were searching for something he had not found before in this room. Monica noticed it, not as a distraction, but as a detail, one of many that formed the larger picture she was quietly observing, and she shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. The man's voice steadied gradually, not because the situation had changed, but because the environment had, the tension that often pressed down on people like him easing just enough to let him breathe, to let him speak without feeling diminished. The judge nodded occasionally, guiding the process, but even he seemed to allow a wider space for the testimony to exist, as if recognizing that something intangible had shifted the balance of the room. Ryan's gaze moved between the witness and Monica, not in suspicion, not in challenge, but in a kind of quiet reflection, as if he were beginning to understand the difference between control and presence, between authority that is imposed and authority that is held without effort. He adjusted his stance again, this time more naturally, his hands resting loosely, his shoulders no longer carrying the same tension, and when the witness faltered on a detail, Ryan did not step in immediately, did not correct or press. He simply waited, allowing the man to find his words again, and in that small restraint, something else shifted, something subtle but real. Monica observed it without reacting, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, but there was a faint acknowledgement in the way she held herself, as if recognizing that change does not announce itself loudly. It appears in moments like this, quiet, almost unnoticed, but meaningful nonetheless. The witness finished his statement, exhaling softly, a release of tension that seemed to ripple through the room, and as he stepped down, he glanced once more toward Monica, this time with something closer to reassurance in his eyes, before returning to his seat. The judge thanked him and moved forward, but the atmosphere had altered in a way that could not be reversed, not by returning to routine, not by ignoring what had already been revealed. Ryan shifted his gaze back to the front, his expression thoughtful now, the sharp edges of certainty replaced by something more measured, more aware, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to acknowledge what had changed, not just in the room, but within himself. Monica Carter remained still, grounded, her presence steady as ever, and as the proceedings continued around her, it became clear that the shift she had brought into the room was not temporary, not dependent on a single moment or a single reveal, but something deeper, something that would continue to shape what followed, quietly, consistently, without needing to be announced again. The courtroom no longer felt like a place where people were simply processed, it felt observed, as if every action now carried consequence beyond the immediate case, and that awareness settled into the smallest details, the way a pen paused before touching paper, the way a chair shifted more quietly, the way voices softened without being asked. Monica Carter stood steady near the front, her presence unchanged, but its effect had deepened, spreading through the room like a quiet current that did not demand attention, yet influenced everything it touched. The judge called for the next document to be reviewed, his tone returning to structure, but his eyes occasionally flicked toward Monica, not out of uncertainty, but out of acknowledgement, as if her presence had become part of the framework itself. The clerk handed over a file, the edges crisp, the pages aligned with careful precision, and as the judge skimmed the contents, the faint rustle of paper echoed in the quiet, a sound that now felt amplified by the stillness that surrounded it. Ryan Whitmore remained in position, but his attention was no longer fixed on controlling the room. It had shifted inward, then outward again, recalibrating, observing, and when the judge asked a procedural question directed toward the officers present, Ryan did not answer immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of consideration, as if weighing his words against something more than just protocol. Another officer responded first, his voice respectful, measured, and Ryan listened, really listened, the way he had not before, allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption. Monica noticed the change, not as a judgment, but as a detail, one more indication that the room was adjusting, not because it had to, but because it recognized something it had previously overlooked. She took a slow breath, the air cool against her lungs, grounding, and let her gaze move briefly toward the gallery, where a few observers sat quietly, their attention fixed not just on the proceedings, but on her, on what she represented in that moment. A woman in the second row held her hands tightly together, her expression thoughtful, almost relieved, as if something unspoken had been validated simply by Monica standing where she was. The judge finished reviewing the document and looked up again, his expression composed, but with a subtle softness that had not been present earlier. "We will proceed with the next phase," he said, and his voice carried forward, steady, but shaped by the awareness that the room had changed. Ryan shifted his stance slightly, the movement natural now, no longer forced, and when he stepped forward this time, it was not to assert control, but to fulfill his role within the structure that had been redefined. "Your Honor," he said, his tone even, respectful. The officer report is ready for review. The words were simple, procedural, but the delivery held a different weight, one that acknowledged rather than imposed. Monica's gaze passed over him briefly, not lingering, but recognizing the adjustment, and in that small acknowledgement, there was a quiet affirmation that change, however gradual, was real. The clerk accepted the report and placed it before the judge, the motion smooth, practiced, and the courtroom continued its work, but with a new undercurrent, one that shaped how each person moved within it. A faint beam of light shifted across the floor as clouds passed outside, the brightness softening, then returning, casting a gentle glow that seemed to follow the rhythm of the room itself. Monica remained still, her posture grounded, her presence steady, and as the proceedings carried on, it became clear that what had happened was not confined to a single moment or a single reveal. It had extended into the way people listened, the way they spoke, the way they chose their words and their silence. Ryan glanced once more toward her, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed through that glance, not apology, not yet, but awareness, the kind that precedes it. Monica did not react outwardly, but the calm in her expression held space for that awareness to exist, to grow, without pressure, without demand. The judge called for a brief pause to organize the next set of documents, and as the room settled into that pause, the quiet returned, not empty, but full, carrying the weight of everything that had shifted and everything that would follow. Monica Carter stood exactly where she had been from the start, unchanged in posture, unchanged in tone, but now fully seen, and in that visibility, the entire room had learned something it could not unlearn. The pause did not feel like a break. It felt like a held breath, the kind that stretches just long enough for something deeper to surface. And in that quiet, the courtroom revealed itself in ways it had not before, not through words, but through the subtle shifts in posture, in attention, in the way people occupied their own space. Monica Carter stood near the front, unchanged in stance, but the stillness around her had taken on a different texture, less tense, more aware, as if the room had stopped resisting something it did not fully understand before. The judge reviewed the next set of documents, his glasses catching the overhead light as he scanned each page, the faint reflection flickering with each movement, while the clerk organized files with quiet efficiency, her hands moving with a steadiness that mirrored the new rhythm settling in. Ryan Whitmore remained just behind his previous position, but his presence had shifted again, not only in how others perceived him, but in how he perceived himself within the room, and for the first time, he allowed that awareness to sit without pushing against it. His gaze drifted briefly toward Monica, then away, then back again, not searching this time, not questioning, but acknowledging something he could not ignore. The silence gave him space he had not expected, space to consider, to replay the moment from earlier, the words he had used, the assumptions he had made, and how quickly certainty had dissolved once the truth entered the room. He inhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, but different now, not driven by authority, but by reflection, and when he exhaled, the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly, enough to be felt, even if not fully seen. Across the room, a young officer shifted in his seat, watching the exchange without appearing to, his eyes moving between Ryan and Monica, absorbing the change, learning from it in a way that would not be spoken aloud but would remain with him long after the day ended. Monica's gaze moved across the room once more, not lingering on any single person, but recognizing the collective presence, the shared space, the subtle transformations taking place within it, and when her eyes returned forward, they held a quiet understanding, not of control, but of responsibility, the kind that does not announce itself loudly but shapes everything it touches. The judge cleared his throat softly, signaling the continuation of proceedings, and as he began to speak again, his voice carried with it a steadiness that aligned with the new tone of the room. "We will now address the procedural review," he said, and the words moved forward, but the weight of what had already occurred remained beneath them, influencing every response, every decision. Ryan stepped forward when prompted, his movement measured, deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice held a clarity that had not been present before, not louder, not more forceful, but more precise, more aware. "Your Honor," he said, "the report reflects the sequence of events as documented." The sentence was simple, procedural, but the delivery carried a different intention, one that aligned with the structure rather than attempting to control it. Monica listened, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held the moment, an openness that allowed the room to continue evolving without interruption. The judge nodded, acknowledging the statement, and the process moved forward, but the undercurrent remained, shaping how each word was received, how each silence was held. A faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside, distant, passing, a reminder that the world beyond this room continued as it always had, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place within these walls. Ryan's gaze lifted once more toward Monica, and this time, he did not look away quickly. He held the glance for a brief second, long enough to acknowledge what had changed, long enough to recognize that the moment had not been about position, but about something deeper, something he was only beginning to understand. Monica met the glance briefly, not extending it, not avoiding it, simply allowing it to exist. And in that brief exchange, there was no tension, no conflict, just a shared awareness that could not be undone. The courtroom continued, voices rising and falling in measured tones, papers shifting, decisions forming. But beneath it all, something had settled, something that would remain long after the case was closed, long after the room emptied. Monica Carter stood grounded in that truth, and Ryan Whitmore, standing just a few feet away, had begun to see it for the first time. The shift did not end when the voices resumed. It deepened, threading itself through every exchange, every pause, until even the structure of the courtroom felt different, not altered in form, but in meaning, and Ryan Whitmore felt that difference settle into him in a way he could not ignore, no matter how still he stood. The judge continued with the procedural review, his tone steady, deliberate, but there was a new weight behind each question, as if every word now carried awareness of the moment that had already redefined the room. "Officer Whitmore," the judge said, lifting his gaze, stepped forward. The instruction was simple, but it landed differently this time, not as a routine call, but as something closer to a test, quiet, unspoken, but present. Ryan moved, one step, then another, the sound of his shoes measured against the marble, no longer echoing with certainty, but with intention, and when he stopped, he stood straighter, not rigid, not defensive, but aware, fully aware of where he was, and who stood just a few feet away. Monica Carter remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, but her attention shifted slightly toward him, not to confront, not to challenge, but to witness, and that subtle attention carried more weight than any direct scrutiny could have. The judge's fingers rested lightly on the bench as he spoke again. "Earlier this morning," he said, "there was a lapse in professional conduct observed in this courtroom." The words were calm, measured, but they did not drift, they settled, precise and unavoidable, and a faint tension moved through the room, not sharp, but present, like a chord that had been struck and was still vibrating beneath everything else. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, a reflex, but he did not look away. He did not shift his stance. He held the moment, even as it pressed against him in ways he had not expected. "This court does not operate on assumption," the judge continued, his voice steady, "nor does it permit conduct that undermines the dignity of any individual present." The statement was not directed at Monica, not directly at Ryan, but it encompassed both, drawing a line that was no longer invisible, a standard that had always existed but had not been enforced in the same way until now. Ryan inhaled slowly, the breath steady but deeper than before, and for a brief second, he closed his eyes, not in avoidance, but in acknowledgement, a moment of internal recalibration that passed quickly but left something behind. When he opened them again, his gaze moved to Monica, not searching, not questioning, but recognizing, fully, the weight of what had occurred, the impact of what had been said and done, and the truth that had followed. The room held still, not waiting for instruction, but waiting for response, for the next movement that would define what this moment would become. Monica did not speak. She did not step forward. She did not fill the space that had been created. She simply stood, her presence steady, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, without direction, and in that stillness, she gave the space back to him, not as a concession, but as an opportunity. Ryan's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension easing just enough to allow something else to surface, something quieter, something more deliberate. And when he spoke, his voice was not loud, not forceful, but clear. "Your Honor," he said, "I understand." The words were simple, but they carried weight, not because of their content, but because of how they were delivered, without defense, without explanation, just acknowledgement. The judge nodded once, not approving, not dismissing, but accepting the statement as it was, and the room seemed to release a breath it had been holding. Monica's gaze remained steady, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held the moment, a quiet recognition that something important had just occurred, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would last. The judge leaned back slightly, his posture settling as he moved forward. "Let us proceed," he said, and the courtroom resumed its rhythm, but it was no longer the same rhythm as before. It carried the weight of what had been acknowledged, the clarity that had been established. Ryan stepped back again, returning to his position, but the movement was different now, not automatic, not habitual, but intentional, and as he stood there, under the same lights, in the same uniform, he understood that something had shifted, not just in the room, but within himself. Monica Carter remained exactly where she was, unchanged in posture, unchanged in tone, but the space around her held a different meaning now, not because she had demanded it, but because she had revealed it. And in that quiet revelation, the entire room had been forced to see something it could no longer ignore. The courtroom did not return to what it had been before. It continued forward, but with a quiet awareness that lingered in every movement, every word, as if the space itself had learned something it would not forget, and Monica Carter stood within that awareness without claiming it, without directing it, simply allowing it to exist. The judge resumed the proceedings, his voice steady, guiding the structure back into place, but the tone carried a subtle depth now, a recognition that the rules being followed had meaning beyond routine, beyond repetition. A new document was presented, its pages aligned neatly as the clerk placed it on the bench, and the faint sound of paper sliding across would seem louder in the stillness that followed, not disruptive, but precise, intentional. Ryan Whitmore remained in position, but something in the way he held himself had shifted further, not just in posture, but in presence, as if he were no longer trying to occupy space, but to understand it, to move within it with awareness rather than assumption. His gaze rested briefly on the document, then lifted, not toward the judge this time, but toward Monica, and for a moment, he did not look away. The silence between them was not tense, not confrontational. It was clear, open, carrying something that had not been there before, something that did not require words to be understood. Monica met the glance briefly, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, but there was a quiet acceptance in it, not of what had happened, but of what was now possible, the space that had opened for something different to take shape. The judge asked a procedural question, his tone measured, and Ryan responded when prompted, his voice even, controlled, but now grounded in something more than habit, more than authority. It carried intention, a deliberate effort to align with the structure rather than stand above it. The courtroom moved forward, but the rhythm felt steadier, less forced, as if each person had adjusted to a new center that did not need to be asserted, only recognized. A faint shift of light passed across the room as clouds moved outside, softening the brightness for a moment before it returned, and in that subtle change, the reflections on the floor shifted, the outlines of shoes, of desks, of still figures becoming briefly blurred, then sharp again, mirroring the clarity that had settled into the space. Monica's gaze moved once more across the room, not searching, not evaluating, but acknowledging, and when her eyes returned forward, they carried a quiet certainty, not of control, but of purpose, the kind that does not need to be declared to be felt. Ryan exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and as he did, the last remnants of tension in his shoulders eased, not completely, but enough to mark a change, enough to signal that something internal had shifted, something that would not revert easily. He adjusted his stance slightly, the movement natural now, no longer a reaction, but a choice, and when he spoke again, it was not to correct, not to assert, but to contribute, his words fitting into the flow of the proceedings without disrupting it. The judge acknowledged the response with a nod, and the process continued, but beneath it, something deeper held the room together, something that had not been present before. A woman in the gallery shifted in her seat, her expression thoughtful, her hands now resting loosely instead of tightly clasped, and a young officer near the wall stood a little straighter, not out of tension, but out of understanding, as if the moment had taught him something he would carry beyond this room. Monica Carter remained steady, her presence unchanged, but its impact now fully realized, not through force, not through declaration, but through the quiet consistency of who she was and how she stood within the space. Ryan Whitmore stood a few feet away, no longer separated by assumption, but connected by awareness, and in that awareness, there was no immediate resolution, no sudden transformation. But there was something real, something that had begun, something that would continue beyond this moment. The courtroom continued its work, voices rising and falling, documents moving from hand to hand, decisions forming, but everything now existed within a different understanding, one that could not be undone, one that had been revealed not through confrontation, but through presence, through stillness, through the quiet strength of a woman who had never needed to raise her voice to change the room around her. The courtroom began to settle into its final rhythm, not with urgency, but with a quiet sense of completion, as if everything that needed to be revealed had already surfaced, and what remained was simply to carry it forward with clarity. The judge closed the last file in front of him, the soft thud of paper against wood echoing gently through the room, and for a brief moment, no one spoke, not because they were waiting for instruction, but because the silence itself felt appropriate, earned, like the final note of something that had been building all along. Monica Carter stood where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held herself now, not in authority, but in quiet completion, as if the room had reached a point where nothing more needed to be proven. Ryan Whitmore remained a few feet away, his stance no longer rigid, no longer uncertain, but grounded, and for the first time since the morning began, he did not look at the room, he looked directly at her, not quickly, not briefly, but fully, allowing the moment to exist without interruption. The distance between them was still there, but it no longer carried tension, it carried understanding, the kind that does not erase what came before, but acknowledges it without resistance. He took a small step forward, measured, deliberate, stopping short of crossing into her space, respecting the line that had once divided them, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, but different, stripped of the certainty that had defined it earlier, replaced by something more deliberate. "Chief," he said, the word clear, intentional, and for a brief moment, it seemed to settle into the room with more weight than anything else spoken that day. Monica met his gaze, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, and she did not respond immediately. Not because she needed to consider, but because the moment itself did not require urgency. The judge watched quietly from the bench, not intervening, not directing, allowing the exchange to unfold without structure, recognizing that what was happening existed outside the usual bounds of procedure. Ryan inhaled slowly, the breath steady, and continued, his words measured, chosen with care. "What I said earlier," he began, then paused, not searching for language, but allowing the truth of the moment to settle fully before continuing. "It should not have been said." The sentence was simple, but it carried weight, not because it explained anything, but because it acknowledged something without condition, without defense. The room remained still, not reacting, not shifting, simply holding the space for what was being said. Monica's gaze did not soften, did not harden, it remained steady, present, and when she finally spoke, her voice was as calm as it had been from the beginning. "What matters," she said, "is what happens after it is understood." The words did not rise, did not press, they settled, clear, precise, and in them, there was no judgment, no dismissal, only a quiet expectation that extended beyond the moment itself. Ryan nodded slightly, the movement small, but genuine, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, only acknowledgement, the kind that signals change not through declaration, but through action yet to come. The judge cleared his throat softly, bringing the room gently back into its structure. "This session is adjourned," he said, and the words moved through the space with a calm finality, signaling the end of the proceedings, but not the end of what had been set into motion. Chairs shifted, papers gathered, quiet conversations began to form, but the tone remained different, softer, more aware, as if each person carried a piece of what had happened with them as they prepared to leave. Monica reached for her folder, closing it with the same controlled motion as before, the sound of paper settling into place marking a quiet conclusion, and then she turned slightly, preparing to step away, not as someone leaving a room, but as someone moving forward from it. Ryan stepped back, allowing her space, not out of obligation, but out of understanding, and as she passed by, their proximity held no tension, only the quiet recognition of what had been revealed between them. She did not stop, did not pause, but as she moved past, her voice, low and steady, carried just enough to reach him. "Respect is not a position," she said. "It is a choice." The words lingered for a moment, then settled, becoming part of the space they left behind. Ryan stood still, watching as she continued forward, the light from the high windows catching briefly along the edge of her coat before she moved beyond it. And for a moment, he did not move, did not speak. He simply stood there, understanding something he had not before, something that would not leave him once he walked out of that room. Monica Carter did not change the structure of the courtroom. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand anything. But as she stepped through the doorway and into the hallway beyond, the quiet she left behind carried more weight than anything that had come before it. The hallway outside the courtroom felt quieter than it should have, the hum of fluorescent lights above mixing with the soft shuffle of footsteps. Monica Carter walked slowly, her pace measured, each step echoing against the walls, but the sound seemed to dissipate as it moved away from the door behind her. She did not look back, not because she was leaving something behind, but because the moment had already passed and the next one had already begun. The door to the courtroom clicked softly behind her, closing without fanfare, but its impact lingered, not in the loudness of the closure, but in the quiet space it created, a space that seemed to follow her now. She reached the elevator, its doors opening as if waiting for her, and as she stepped inside, the soft chime of the doors closing seemed to seal the transition, marking a shift that had already begun but had not fully settled. Monica pressed the button for the ground floor, the movement simple, but intentional, and as the elevator descended, she stood still, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her gaze fixed ahead but not focused on anything in particular. The rhythm of the elevator's descent was steady, and she let the motion take her, grounding her in the quiet steadiness of the space she occupied. A few floors passed, each one marked by the soft sound of the elevator's movement, and as the doors opened again, the shift that had occurred in the courtroom followed her out into the world beyond it. She stepped out of the elevator and into the lobby, where the usual buzz of conversation filled the space, people moving in and out of the building, their voices rising and falling in the usual cadence of a busy day. But as Monica moved through the lobby, the energy around her seemed to part without anyone noticing, the space around her clearing without effort, as if the very act of her presence had made room for something else to take hold. She did not need to make a scene, did not need to command attention. The room moved around her, and she let it, not controlling it, but allowing it to shift as she moved through it. The doors to the outside opened as she approached, and she stepped into the daylight, the warmth of the sun brushing against her skin, and for a moment, she paused, standing still in the threshold between the building and the world beyond. She looked up at the sky, the clouds drifting lazily across the horizon, and she took a slow breath, the air filling her lungs and grounding her in the present moment. For a brief second, everything felt still, as if the world had stopped moving, just for her, just for this moment. But the stillness did not last long, and the world outside continued, the cars passing by, the sounds of the city filling the air, but it didn't matter. Monica stood at the edge of it, not apart from it, but in a different relationship with it now, one that was grounded, steady, but not defined by the chaos around her. She turned slightly, walking toward the curb where a car was waiting, the driver nodding as she approached. She did not speak, did not give any indication that anything had changed, But the way she moved, the way she carried herself, spoke louder than any words could. As the car began to pull away, she looked out the window, watching the city pass by, the rhythm of the streets matching the rhythm inside her, steady, measured, and certain. The world continued to move, but Monica Carter had already found her place within it, not through force, not through volume, but through something quieter, something that didn't need to be announced, something that had always been there, waiting to be recognized.